This week's author is Frank Zafiro. Steph Kopriva is a disgraced police officer turned investigator. In the years since he left the police department after a terrible mistake, his life has been a slow journey toward redemption. Now, a decade and a half removed from his greatest failure, he's still not entirely there, but he is closer. In today's story, his involvement in the investigation at hand isn't something he seeks out, but his sense of duty to the victim is an underlying reason for doing so. Kopriva's version of duty is still very guilt-driven, and so he sometimes ends up in situations he'd be better off avoiding. But life, much like he discovers, is also true of the game of checkers. It isn't as simple and straightforward as we think or wish. Find more Steph Kopriva stories on Frank's website and from your favorite book retailers. Welcome to Mysteries to Die For. I'm TG Wolff, trying really hard not to lose it, because I'm here with Jack, my piano player and producer. This is a podcast where we combine storytelling with original music to put you at the heart of a mystery. All of our stories are structured to challenge you to beat the detective to the solution. This means these are arrangements. Instead of word-for-word readings, oh my God, Jack, you are so messing me up. Jack and I performed these live if you haven't figured it out. No front, no fakes, oh, good Lord. Jack and I performed these live, front to back, no breaks, no fakes, no retakes. This is Season 7, Games People Play. Games are about competition conducted according to rules with participants working toward a goal. Games are part of every culture and are one of the oldest forms of social interaction and engagement. Games can be fun, challenging, and exhilarating. They can also be intense, cutthroat, and lethal. This season, our authors have fashioned deadly games and unscrupulous villains to test your detection skills. This is Episode 6A, Checkers is the featured game. This is A Checkered Past by Frank Zafiro. Okay, first, Jack, what's our instrument that's on your keyboard today?
This is, oh my gosh, I'm loud. Whoops.
Adjustment needed.
There we go. Nope, that's not better. That was the wrong dial. Oh, this is going horribly wrong.
Did you turn down the piano?
Yeah, I did. Oh, now I'm too quiet. Am I? I can't tell. Oh my God, this is terrible. All right, this is good enough. I'll adjust it in post.
So much for live. He's gonna adjust it in post.
Badly. No, it's gonna. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I have a little reader. Oh, now my microphone's falling. It's a tenor sax. It's a tenor saxophone.
Okay, and Frank, I think you owe me here because you didn't hear some of the ones that he wanted to use first that I kept vetoing.
There was a sitar, a banjo. So I don't even. This one sounded like bones.
Yeah.
Just like someone's just playing with bones.
It wasn't cool. It was not cool.
Oh.
We differ. We agree to disagree on that.
Yeah, apparently.
We'll use it on your episode. The next Detective Conley will use the bones. Well, everybody, today's story is a double episode, which means that its story doesn't fit in one episode. So we're going to hear the first half today, and then we'll be back next week for the second half and the deliberation. This is going to be a full episode, so I might take a few breaks just to help us, keep our mojo in the right place. But sit back, relax, and start contemplating a checkered past. Chapter 1. I should have known that something was wrong that morning. Groggy from a late night, I spilt the ground coffee while pouring it into the filter section of the pot. I muttered a curse and finished loading the coffee maker. While it hissed and spit at me, I cleaned up the mess, which was no easy feat. Those little black flecks seemed to go everywhere, including sticking to the bottoms of my bare feet. Once I finished, instead of standing at the pot waiting for it to fill, I stumbled back to the bedroom and got dressed. By the time I came out, the pot was nearly finished. I didn't wait for the final wet puff that signaled completion. Instead, I grasped the handle and hurriedly poured a cup. Hot coffee splashed upward and scalded the back of my hand between the thumb and forefinger. Instinctively, I pulled my hand away, cursing and sloshing more of the umber brew in the process. When I replaced the pot, the sizzle of liquid on the warmer seemed to chastise me. I set the cup on the counter and ran some cold water over my hand. With my free hand, I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. I'd been up late the night before, trying to serve a subpoena on a reluctant witness in a case for my employer, defense attorney Joel Harity. The witness in question was a member of an outlaw motorcycle gang with a clubhouse out on East Sprague. Knocking on the door wasn't an option, so I sat outside in my car long into the night, waiting for my target to leave so I could serve him. Instead, the lights in the clubhouse eventually went out and no one exited. I returned home for a few hours of sleep. I snapped off the cold water from the faucet, grabbed my half-empty cup and added some fresh coffee to it. Then I trudged toward the front door. A glance out the window to the park across the street told me Mick hadn't arrived yet. I guess he might be having the same sort of bad start to the day I was. Usually, by this time in the morning, the old man was already on the bench in the park. He'd lay out the checkerboard on the stone table before him, the black and red pieces already in place, an unspoken invitation. Then he'd sit, reading a book and waiting for challengers. I decided to stroll over and wait for him to arrive. The morning sun was bright but hadn't been up long enough to burn away the cool from last night. After a long, hot summer, the impending crispness of fall was welcome. The metal bench was still damp, so I ran my forearm across it, drying a spot with my shirt sleeve. All around me, the sounds of the neighborhood filled my ears. A dog barked a block away. The light buzz of traffic of the morning commute drifted over from Ash Street. Birds chirped. On the far side of the park, a trio of teenagers screamed loudly at each other, pretending it wasn't to get attention. A typical morning. In other words, peaceful. I took a seat and waited for Mick. But he never showed. Chapter 2. The newspaper text glared up at me. I don't know why I checked the obituaries. I was only 40, far too young to be looking at the daily catalog of who recently died. But thumbing through the newspaper, even the sections that held little interest to me, had become part of my morning ritual when my work allowed. I cared little about the financial section and less about the sports pages, but I still perused those headlines. The same held true for the obits. Today was different. Michael Mick Darabont passed away suddenly on September 14th. A lifelong resident of River City, after immigrating from Australia as a boy, Mick ran a successful business until his retirement. He is survived by his daughter, Lula Titan, and two sons, Donald and Aaron Darabont. Memorial services will be held on September 17 at Woodford's Funeral Home. I set down the newspaper and reached for my coffee cup. Sitting at my kitchen table, it was hard to believe that Mick was gone. Staring down into my cup, I tried to remember the last time I'd seen him. I'd been busy with the case Harity had me working, which resulted in odd hours and long nights, not to mention traveling down to the Tri-Cities and making a loop through central Washington, serving subpoenas and interviewing potential witnesses. Had it been nearly a week since our last game of morning checkers? I closed my eyes and remembered our first game. Chapter 3. Mick Darabont was in his mid-70s, though he appeared to have lived a high-mileage life. If he claimed to have been a decade older, nobody would have blinked. His long, narrow face was riddled with wrinkles. Age spots dotted his arms and neck, and his long, bony fingers resembled claws more than hands. Despite his appearance, he turned out to be a warm person, at least once I got past his gruff exterior. Of course, that took some work. The first time I saw him sitting in the park was in late spring. He sat with the board laid out on the table in front of him and his nose buried in a Tom Clancy novel. I was intrigued, so I approached him and stood nearby, waiting for him to notice me. He must have read most of a page before he stabbed a thin finger at the place in the text and looked up at me. "You gonna say something or stand there like an idiot?" His voice had the lightest trace of an accent, too slight to even place. "I'm good at the idiot part," I said. "I might just stick with that." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. He slid an empty matchbook into the paperback and set it on the bench next to him. Then he motioned to the board. "Do you play?" "Play?" I asked. "Doesn't everyone? It's checkers, not chess." He scowled, spoken like a true idiot. I glanced around the park. A few parents watched over kids of various ages while the youngsters climbed on the play structures. A pair of young lovers sat on a blanket, sunning themselves and holding hands. Further away, a group of teenagers smoked and shouted obscenities at each other. "No takers?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Bunch of cowards." I chuckled. "You think they're scared of checkers?" "Nope," he said. "Scared of me, though." I looked him over again and had to agree. The only people in the park that day that might consider approaching him were the loud teenagers, and then only on a dare. "You should wear a sweater," I suggested, "like Mr. Rogers. Cultivate that harmless old man look." "Who are you calling old?" he asked, sizing me up. "You're more mutton than lamb yourself." I laughed. It was true enough. When I motioned to the seat opposite him, Mick nodded his permission. I sat down and introduced myself. He did the same. Then I studied the board. "Who goes first?" I asked. "I know it's white in chess, but—" "Black moves first," he said. The black pieces were on his side of the board. "All right," I said. "I haven't played since I was a kid, but let's do it." Mick sniffed and moved a piece. We spent the next half hour shuffling pieces around the board. It took falling into a couple of stupid traps and getting double jump before the flow of the game came back to me. By that time, I was fighting a losing battle, and the only real goal became prolonging my own defeat. Finally, Mick maneuvered my last remaining checker into a corner. Regardless of which space I moved, he was poised to jump my piece and win. I turned over my hands. "Checkmate," I said. He scowled. "This is checkers," he said in his raspy voice. "It isn't chess. You don't get to surrender. You win or you lose." He dipped his chin toward the board. "Now, move your man." I slid the checker diagonally to the left. Mick grinned and jumped it with his king. Triumphantly, he collected my piece and added to the stack next to the board. "Good game," I said, not really meaning it. "You played like a child," Mick said matter-of-factly. "At least at first. Then you fought like a man." "Go again?" I asked. Mick nodded. "Sure." Chapter 4. That was the beginning of our semi-regular matches throughout the remainder of spring and all through the summer. On mornings that I was around the house and spotted him across the street at the picnic table, I joined him. After the first couple of trips, I started bringing along a cup of coffee for him. That small gesture surprised him and went a long ways toward softening his rough demeanor. He opened up slightly, sharing how his parents emigrated from Australia when he was still in grammar school. That cleared up that trace of an accent I'd been hearing and wondering about. I learned he had a family, too, though he shared precious little about them. He mentioned that he retired after working 45 years in a shoe repair business. When he called himself a cobbler, I was embarrassed to admit I didn't know what he meant. I thought it entailed laying out the cobblestones on those archaic roadways, only a few of which remained in River City. "Not much cause anymore for my kind of work," he told me. Cobblestones? I asked naively. What? No, he said. Shoes. Nowadays, people buy 'em, wear 'em till something breaks, then throw 'em out. He shook his head. It's wasteful. I looked down at my own feet, shod in a pair of athletic shoes. One of them was filled with a prosthetic that ran up to just below my knee. Before I lost that part of my leg, I'd usually worn a pair of cowboy boots. I told Mick that, emphasizing how I'd paid to have the heels and soles reworked on 2 occasions. I knew I liked you, mate, he said, though he cast a questioning look at the current footwear. No boots today, though, huh? No. I didn't explain why. That led to a story I didn't want to tell, a story that led to even worse ones. He beat me soundly for the first 20 or so times we played. After that, I started winning once every 5 or 6 games. The key seemed to be getting kinged first. At least it was for me. The rules are simple, Mick once said, but it's not a simple game. People have been playing a variation of it for thousands of years for a reason. He looked at me closely. You know what that reason is? No clue, I admitted. He sniffed. Figures. Most young people don't. Thanks for calling me young, I said. Don't get too excited. He laughed. It's all relative. You're only young compared to me. Either way, Mick, I guess I'm not wise enough to know what you're talking about. Mick stabbed a bony finger at the board. A game like this makes a man strategize. It creates mental discipline. I leaned back, considering. I thought chess was supposed to do that. Chess, Mick spat. An elitist game played by a bunch of liberals? I raised my brow. This was the first time politics of any time had come up. Liberals, huh? He waved a hand. Effete snobs who created that game to add a bunch of complicated rules for no reason other than avoiding the simple realities of the world. He tapped the table. Life is simple and straightforward. People complicate it. Hard to disagree. Why do you suppose that is? Oh, to twist up the truth so they live with themselves mostly, he said. Or create new rules so that the old rules won't apply to them. He shook his head in disgust. Instead of getting good at the rules, reality throws their way. I thought about his philosophy. I always tended to believe that life was complicated. My own journey through it seemed to highlight that idea, but Mick clearly disagreed. Life is no more complicated than what's on this board, he proclaimed. You live and you die. You take what you can. What you take comes at someone else's expense, and, in the end, there are winners and losers. Harsh, I said. That's life. He slid a checker into my back row. Now king me. Chapter 5. I didn't have many friends in this world. Outside my girlfriend, Anna, there was really only Clell, a security guard who quite literally saved my life one winter night years ago. I suppose I could call Joe Harity a friend, though that relationship was muddled by him being my employer. His assistant, Kylie, barely counted as an acquaintance. Maybe that was why I valued those mornings I spent with Mick. His rough and tumble view of the world wasn't one I always agreed with, but I had to at least consider his points. Same thing with his pithy observations about the world around us. His advice, on the few occasions I sought it, was always sound and rested on a strong foundation of reason and common sense. We fell into a rhythm, drinking coffee and playing a couple games while chatting. Anna teased me that I was becoming, quote, another old man in the park. I found that I looked forward to those mornings, though. They brought a certain easy peace to my life. That's why, on the morning of Mick's funeral, I rose early, leaving Anna asleep in my bed. She offered to accompany me today, but I turned her down. Last night was a patrol graveyard shift for her, and another one loomed tonight. I didn't want to ask her to miss out on all that sleep during the middle of her work week. Being a police officer was hard enough without being exhausted. Besides, it wasn't like Mick was family. And maybe there was something more. Maybe because he was a piece of my life that I hadn't really shared with anyone else, it seemed only right that I do this alone. While the coffee brewed, I took my only suit from the closet. I dressed in the living room, not wanting to disturb Anna's sleep. Then I took a pair of cups and wandered over to the empty bench. I sat one mug on the table where Mick's checkerboard had usually rested and sipped from the other while the September sun warmed the morning. I thought of all of our conversations, how he'd helped me with advice, always listened, never judged. Well, that last part wasn't true. He judged the situations I described a lot, but he never judged me. For a man whose father bailed on most of my life, and a mother who did the same for even more of it, those small gestures of near parental acceptance from Mick were something I craved. I don't think I realized it until I learned he was gone. Once I finished my coffee, I poured out the other mug next to the bench and went inside. I had a funeral to go to. Chapter 6. Woodford's funeral home was in an otherwise residential neighborhood in the northwest River City. I've never heard of the place until a couple years ago. The memorial for my mother, Sharon, was held here. The front door stood open. In the foyer, a sign directed me to the correct room. I was grateful it wasn't in the same one used for my mother's service. Inside, a number of people were clumped in chairs and... Okay, let's try that sentence again. Inside, a number of people were clumped in the chairs near the front, mostly quiet except for some low murmurs. A few others were dotted throughout the rest. I slid into a chair in the back row, trying to remain quiet as I did so. 5 minutes later, an officiant stepped through the other door near the front. I recognized her immediately, Mary Cole. She presided over my mother's funeral as well. Mary was a slender woman in her 50s. Her hair was completely gray, the color of a vibrant iron. She gave off the vibe of somebody who liked to hike a lot of trails and drank a lot of green tea. Neither was particularly uncommon in this part of the country, but Mick had been more of a coffee man, who no doubt ate steak and eggs and whose only hike was to the store for more beer. I guess it didn't matter who said the words for him, though. He wasn't around to complain. Mary stepped up to the lectern and greeted everyone. She spoke about Mick's history, how he came to the United States as a boy, started his career at 17, a family at 29. Her easy way of speaking made it seem like she knew the man personally, which I doubted. But I remembered how she accomplished the same faux familiarity when it came to Sharon. It must be a talent that came with the job. A few minutes into Mary's speech, a woman slipped into the room and stood in the doorway. She was in her late 30s, dressed in a black dress that hugged her curves. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a loose bun. Wide blue eyes glanced around for an empty chair. There were a number of them all over the back half of the room, but she chose the one next to me. As she sat, a wave of her perfume washed past me. I didn't recognize the musky scent. After listening to the officiant for a few seconds, she leaned toward me and said in a strangely conversational tone, Not a bad turnout for the old bastard." I glanced sideways at her, then nodded hesitantly. I was hoping that, by not answering aloud, she'd be discouraged from continuing to talk, but she was undeterred. "I think a few of his enemies would show up at least to gloat," she shrugged. "I guess he outlived most of them, though." She nodded toward the clump of bodies toward the front of the room, and the rest clearly made it. I leaned toward her silently. "I think we're supposed to be quiet for this part." She laughed. "How old are you? You gotta be 40 or so, right?" I dipped my chin once. "Well then," she said, "you ought to know that once you hit 40, supposed to can go fuck itself." I didn't know how to answer that. She cocked her head. "Never seen you before. Who are you?" My name's Steph, I whispered. She looked me over. You're not family. No, I said. I just met Mick earlier this year. Her eyes narrowed. Where? At the park, I told her. I played checkers with them. A slow smile spread across her face, but there was no humor in it. Well then, she said. You really didn't know him at all, did you? Then she leaned back and didn't say another word for the rest of the service. Okay, I'm going to take a mini break here. Let us stretch our mental minds.
Buongiorno delivery service. Here's my dissertation so far, is that the wizard in Harry Potter that made the fighting chess, biggest liberal on the planet. Okay, according to Mick.
Chess.
Do you remember the chess where that fights each other, that murder?
In the very first Harry Potter? Yeah, I remember. Okay, yeah.
Mick must think he's the biggest liberal this side of the Mississippi.
Harry Potter, that is.
Whoever made it.
Okay.
I don't know. Probably wasn't Dumbledore. I'm just saying, if he thinks chess is a liberals game, that would drive him crazy.
I thought it was an academics game or an intellectual game.
He says it's liberals.
He does.
And you can't argue with old.
No. So while we're paused here, I want to point out to everybody that we are still ad-free. And in exchange for not making you move to hit the fast forward button, because I've kept this to under a number of seconds, so you'll end up missing the story. Check out our author's books. Take a look at Frank's website. Look at his catalog and his I was going to say backlist, but is that the right word?
I can find out.
Frank has several series, including Steph Privas, and I'm sure that one will fit your crime fiction taste. They are everywhere from mysteries to hard-boiled crime. Really cool stories.
And hard-boiled eggs. Stinky. All right, let's start again.
All right. Chapter 7, once Jack has his mic off and his fingers on. Mary Cole wrapped up her summary of Mick's life and her exhortations that those in attendance see his passing as part of God's plan. Then she announced that the burial would follow immediately at Forest Lawn Cemetery. Are you going to the box drop? The woman asked me. Box drop? It took me a moment to register what she meant. Then I felt foolish for not understanding right away. Maybe it was the casual rudeness of the description that threw me off. I cleared my throat. I hadn't decided. Can you give me a ride, she asked. I took a taxi here. Shook my head slowly. I don't even know you. Oh, well, let's rectify that. She held out her hand. I'm Lula Teton. Mick was my dad. I blinked in surprise. Lula wiggled her fingers, prompting me. I took her hand and shook it. I'm sorry for your loss, I said automatically. She raised a brow. Ain't we all? Come on, let's go before the rest of the family sees me. Chapter 8.
What was that a 3-sentence chapter? I blame you. I know you put that stop in there.
I did not put that stop in there. Frank put the stop in there.
Oh, my bad, Frank. That's on me.
Chapter 8. Lula didn't speak for several blocks. From the passenger seat, she glanced around the interior of my old Celica. What do you do for a living? She asked. I'm an investigator, I said. Really? Her interest seemed genuine. Like a cop, you mean? I shook my head. I work for an attorney. Oh. Disappointment laced her tone. She looked around the car some more. Doesn't pay well, huh? I glanced at her, surprised. I do okay. She lifted her hands in apology. Just saying, you can tell a lot about a man from what he drives. She thought for a second and then shrugged. And his shoes. Well, I drive this car because I own it outright and it gets me where I need to go. I didn't add that it had been a payment for my very first investigation I ever did as a civilian. So what's that tell you? That you're practical, Lula said, and you don't care about image, only results. I didn't answer. She was surprisingly accurate in her assessment. I'd say more, she said, but I didn't get a look at your shoes. When I looked over at her, she was smiling mischievously. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead," she said, her tone inviting and the slightest bit suggestive. "Mick was your father?" I asked. "Excuse me for saying so, but you don't seem too broken up." Lula put a hand to her ample chest. "I'm shattered," she protested with dramatic sarcasm. "You two weren't close, I take it." She thought about it before replying and then said, "I was Daddy's little girl for a long time, no doubt. But there comes a time in every child's life when you finally see your parent for the person they truly are. You know what I mean?" I remembered Sharon and her return to my life shortly before she died. "I do," I said. She pushed a stray lock of hair from her eyes. "Then you know that once you see someone through that lens, it can't be unseen. At that point, you either accept who they are and have a new relationship, or you pull back and preserve whatever used to be there. I call that second decision retreat and pretend." Simple options, I thought. "And that's what you did?" "It's what I tried to do," she smiled wanly. "But the truth is obdurate, isn't it? Bastard just refuses to go away." I hesitated, surprised by her use of the word obdurate. It didn't seem to match her personality. Maybe that's why I asked a stupid question next. "Mick, you mean?" "No, the truth." She thought for a second. "But he was certainly a bastard, too." "Huh." The grunt escaped before I had time to think about it. "Huh, what?" Lula asked. I shrugged. "I just had a different experience, is all. Mick seemed like a nice guy, if a little gruff." "Of course he did," Lula said. "By the time you met him, he was old and trying to get into heaven." Her assessment didn't match the man I knew. "I don't think that was it." "No?" she asked. "Then I guess he just took advantage of the fact that you didn't know any better." I drove in silence for several blocks. Then I asked, "Was he that bad?" "No," Lula said. "He was worse." Chapter 9. As we pulled into Forest Lawn Cemetery, Lula turned in her seat to face me. "You said you were an investigator. Can I hire you?" "Hire me?" I echoed. "For what?" She hedged. "I don't trust the cops. They're not doing jack." Which told me nothing, so I pressed. "About what?" "Figuring out who killed Daddy." My head snapped to face her, causing the car to swerve slightly. I corrected course and then looked at her again. "Mick was murdered?" There was nothing in the paper about that. "Not according to the cops," Lula said, her expression pinched. "This detective is buying the bullshit that he fell and hit his head on the bathroom sink. Accidental death, he's saying." Well, she had my attention. "Who's the detective?" "Some Asian prick," she said. "Masuga or something." "Matsuda?" I asked. She gave a sharp nod. "Yeah, that sounds right." Pressed my lips together and said nothing. Lula was right. In my experience, Richie Matsuda was a prick, though Anna had a different opinion of him. Bad attitude or not, he certainly wasn't incompetent. I collected my thoughts while turning right onto another asphalt lane and then following the black hearse that had made it up the hillside already. "Cops tend to know their business," I finally said. "If the detective thinks—" "No way," Lula interrupted. "One of the bastards shoved him. I know it." Her gaze fixed on me. "And I need you to find out who it was." I shook my head. I'll pay," she said, cutting me off. "It's not that," I told her gently. "Then what is it?" She snapped the question. "Are you not good at your job? Afraid? What?" I stared straight ahead, once more taken aback by her forward nature. She was all over the map, moving from irreverent behavior to sexy siren to biting statements. The shifts not only made my head spin, but made me wonder if she was unhinged. Then again, maybe it was simpler than that. I remembered how grief manifested differently for everyone. "I have a single client," I said. She eased back. "The lawyer you mentioned? Are you going to make me call him?" she asked. "Does he handle wills and probate?" "Not usually." I pulled to the edge of the lane and put the Celica into park. Then I shut off the engine and turned toward Lula. Why would you need a lawyer? I don't think I need a lawyer, not yet anyway, but I need an investigator. Her big eyes seemed to get bigger. She dropped her hand onto my forearm. Her fingers felt like fiery brands. Please, help me? I knew she was working me, and I could feel the primordial tug that resulted from her effort. I wished now I had taken Anna up on her offer to come along. I'll ask a few questions, I said, but no promises. She smiled. Good enough. Chapter 10. Lulu and I walked together toward the burial site. After a few steps, she noticed my odd gait. Are you hurt? She asked. I gave her a short shake of my head. Not exactly. It's an old injury. I lost part of my leg. Her eyes widened in surprise, and then she nodded in understanding. She slowed her pace slightly, and I liked her a little bit more for doing that. At the graveside, the mourners were gathered much more closely than at Woodford's. A few of them cast glances my way. Some looks were curious. A couple were darker, more accusatory. Mary's voice was lighter here without the walls to resonate off of. She spoke briefly compared to her earlier speech. Then she turned to a man in his late 40s. Mick's oldest son, Donald, would like to say a few words. Donald Darabont looked nothing like his father. Where Mick had been rangy, Donald was pudgy. Mick wasn't a tall man, but his son was downright short. He wore an expensive suit and eyeglasses with round lenses. His hair was thin and receding, and when he spoke, it was with a reedy voice. My father wasn't what most people would call a great man, he began, but he was my hero. Next to me, Lula snorted. Donald's gaze cut to her, but he didn't otherwise react. Instead, he continued his eulogy, detailing the many reasons he admired Mick. I listened carefully, remembering Lula's description of her father. Through that lens, many of the traits Donald lionized could be viewed in an either positive or negative light. Was Mick tenacious or stubborn? Loyal or a grudge holder? Did he not suffer fools, or was he simply rude? I suppose it depended on who was applying the label. When Donald finished, Mary resumed her officiant duties. She offered up a final prayer, a little more commentary on God's plan for all of us, and finished by announcing that there would be a reception at the home of Donald and Louise Darabont. Come on, Lula said, nudging my shoulder. Let's see if I can remember where Donnie the ass licker lives. Chapter 11. On the trip to the reception, I tried to dissuade Lula from hiring me. The police have the best resources, I told her, and training. And they don't give a shit, she added. I wanted to say she was completely wrong, but I knew she was only partially so. Mick's death investigation was a job for the detective who handled it. Another task in Richie Matsuda's workday. Sure, many cops had strong work ethic and sympathy for the victims. Matsuda was no different. But would he care about a death as much as a family member? Not even close. Why do you think somebody hurt Mick? I asked Lula. I mean, people slip in the bathroom all the time. My father, she said, was a mean bastard. Plenty of people had reason to hurt him. And I think he was finally old enough for someone to get brave and try. But there's no proof, I pointed out. She huffed. He's dead, isn't he? That isn't proof, I said, determined to make my point. Really? She cocked her head. Every one of those true crime shows I've ever seen calls the body the best proof there is. I couldn't argue that, even though it really wasn't a point I was trying to make. At least tell me what I can expect, I said to her. Who are these people I'm going to be talking to? Oh, hell, she said. Where to start? Start with Donald, I said. Chapter 12.
Damn, there's a lot of chapters, Frank.
There are a lot of chapters, Frank.
Making me play a lot of songs.
Donald Darabont's home was big by River City standards. Not South Hill Mansion big, but it was a large house on 5 Mile Prairie, which was his generation's new money answer to the old money luxury of the South Hill. I parked up the street a half block away and walked slowly to the house. Even without Lula's indication, it would have been easy to find. Multiple cars parked in front and a steady trickle of people meandering toward the front door made it obvious. Even without those clues, the giant script above the entrance declaring it the Darabont home was a dead giveaway. Lula didn't bother knocking. She waltzed through the front door with me trailing behind her. Inside, the small foyer opened into a much larger living room where most of the mourners were gathered. A table against the wall was covered in various bowls and pans of food, soft drinks, and some harder stuff at one end. Vodka, Lula breathed in relief. Thank God. She took a couple steps in that direction, then stopped and turned to me. You want something? I shook my head. Suit yourself. She glanced around the room. Get to work then. I wandered through the small assembly of people, making my way toward Donald Darabont. He was holding court in the center of the room, accepting sympathies from all comers. He's nothing but a shoe salesman, Lula had told me in the car. A shoe salesman who missed his calling as a used car salesman. His shitty little store is hemorrhaging cash. She gave me a knowing look. An inheritance check wouldn't hurt his bottom line any. Now, Donald eyed me as I approached. When I held out my hand, he automatically took it, but his expression didn't soften. I'm sorry for your loss, I said. Thank you, he replied, his tone flat and slightly guarded. He released my hand. But I don't know you. My name is Stefan Kopriva, I explained. I was a friend of Mick's. We played checkers in the park near my house. Ah, Donald nodded slowly. I see. You look surprised, I said. You came with Lula, he said, so I figured you were one of her cockled toys. I tilted my head. Cockled toys? Donald waved a hand. If you don't know, don't worry about it. I just thought that since you rode together. I met her before the service at Woodford's, I told him. She asked for a ride. He smirked. That sounds like Lula. Needing an opener, I went with business. She said you owned a small shoe store? Small? Donald shook his head. She would say that. No, Darabont's is the biggest specialty store in the mall. My mistake, I said. He looked affronted. You've never heard of us? I shrugged. I'm not in the market for new shoes very often. Donald glanced down at my basic black dress shoes. His expression told me he wasn't impressed by my style choice. How's business? I asked casually. Good. His response was automatic and immediate. It was a tone I heard from people who wanted to shut down any further line of inquiry. Why do you ask? I turned my hands over apologetically, just making small talk. Like you said, we don't know each other. Donald pursed his lips, suspicion in his eyes. What did you say your name was? Steph. No, your last name. Kopriva, I told him. Well, Mr. Kopriva, if you excuse me, I have other guests to attend to. Of course, I said, I understand. I expected him to walk away to follow up on his statement with action, but he stared at me until I got the point. I nodded to him, and I turned away. Okay, another little break, another little mental stretch.
Beautiful, gorgeous. I have to say, Frank, I love how you incorporated acoustics into this.
What do you mean acoustics?
One time he mentioned that her voice was lighter because she wasn't in a church, cathedral, funeral home.
Oh, yeah, the officiant?
Uh-huh.
You like that?
I liked it because that's the only thing I know about right now because that's my major in college.
Yes, Jack just had a class in acoustics, and he did manage to pass it, didn't you?
Well, that was last year.
Oh, last year.
But yes. But I found the...
You found there was a lot of math in it.
And I found the textbook from last year. So I went back through that because it's fun when you're not in the class. It's kind of like when you learn to do something and you hate it, and then you realize you can do it for fun now because you know how to do it without having to, think.
Yes.
And now it's fun. It sucked at the time.
Yeah.
Pretty much all of college sucks when you're in the class. like Ableton. It's the software that we're gonna start using here soon. Because we're using Studio One right now, and we've been having just a few issues because of we have to put a few updates on it, and I'm lazy. So that's the main reason they don't have the updates. But like, I did a whole class on that, and it sucked, man. I thought I was dying the whole time, and now I love it. And now it's what I want to switch to recording on, because it's what I know better at this point. Because I did a whole class instead of, because Studio One, we just learned by YouTube videos, because we needed we used to be using Audacity.
Yes, we did.
I don't know why we're talking about this. I started it. It's my fault. Actually, it's your fault, Frank. You mentioned acoustics one time, and you set me off.
You got him off track. He's like a dog chasing a squirrel from tree to tree. You can't be talking about other
interesting things, even if it's just she sounds louder because she's outside, or quieter. Whatever it was.
Whatever it was, it gets the Jack thumbs up seal approval.
Apparently.
All right. You ready for chapter 13?
13.
There's 17 chapters in this.
This is the unlucky chapter. Someone dies here, because it's 13. That's my prediction. That's the deliberation for this episode, is someone dies in chapter 13.
At the refreshments table, I found a small bottle of sparkling water and reached for it. You met Donnie, huh? I turned to see Aaron Darabont at my elbow. He was in his early 30s with boyish good looks. His stylish jacket and open collar had a look of purposeful casualness. If Lula hadn't told me he worked at Starbucks, I'd have pegged him as being on the board of a small nonprofit. His vibe landed somewhere between hipster and hippie. From the expression on his face, he was also already well down the road to being sloshed. I passed on my condolences, I said, shifting the bottle of water to my left hand and holding out my right. I should offer the same to you. Aaron brushed his hair out of his eyes, and as he reached to shake my hand, thanks. His words had a slightly heavy quality to them, a harbinger of what came next, slurring them. Hard to believe the old bastard is really gone. Were you two close? I asked when we exchanged our names and dropped our handshake. God, no, he laughed. For Dad, I was an afterthought, at best. Then he seemed embarrassed at what he said. Sorry, I just met you, and here I am, spewing family drama. His forward nature immediately reminded me of Lula, who was watching the exchange from the opposite side of the room, a drink in her hand. That comparison was interesting, since her own description of Aaron was that he was nothing like her. I know what I want, she said to me in the car. Aaron doesn't know shit. He's a fuck-up, floating around, barely moored to anything other than his shifts at the coffee shop and whatever girl he's trying to bang. No surprise, really. When you name a boy Aaron and spell it that way, he's bound to start out life confused and get worse from there. How do you know Dad? Aaron asked me. We played checkers in the park, I said. Aaron nodded his approval. Cool. Then he smiled. Typical Dad. That surprised me. What do you mean? All that money, Aaron said. He could have done whatever he wanted, but he chose to sit in the park and wait around for somebody to play checkers with. How lame is that? I think he read books when there were no takers, I said. Aaron held up his hand, sloshing his drink. Mea culpa, he said in mock apology. Sarcasm dripped from his words. That is so much better. What do you mean about all that money? I asked him. Aaron cocked his head. Didn't you know he was loaded? No, I said. I'd never really thought about it. Well, he was, Aaron said, at least compared to how he lived. The man could have spent most of the year traveling or chasing women or whatever he wanted. Instead, he sat in the park playing a children's game. I held a small, self-deprecating grin. He didn't see it that way. No doubt, Aaron said. If you don't mind me asking, I said, where did his money come from? The leather repair store. Aaron motioned over his shoulder, and I turned to follow the gesture. Standing alone in one corner was a gaunt man in his 50s. He stood with a hunched posture, holding a drink in both hands, looking as if he was concerned someone might try to snatch it away. His black suit was old, but impeccable. He caught me looking at him and scowled. The shift in his expression made his long, thin nose seem even pointier. Who's that? I asked. Mark Clavers, Aaron told me, Dad's business partner. His apprentice, I supposed. Or heir apparent, he shrugged. Kind of depends on how you look at it. I'm not sure I understand, I said, studying the picture. Join the club, said Aaron flippantly. He drained the last of his glass and poured himself another whiskey. I noticed he didn't add ice or any mixer to it. No one knows the details between the two of them when Dad retired. Donald thinks Mar bought Dad out, but I'm not so sure. I heard doubt and hurt in his voice, but still pressed. Why not? I was over at Dad's a couple of years ago, he said, and I saw a check on the counter. Looked like Mar was still paying him his monthly share. He could have financed the buyout, I suggested. Aaron shrugged. I'm not 100% on how that works. One thing's for sure, though. Whatever deal he worked out, it would have been the one that paid him the most now and left the least amount for his kids after he was gone. My expression must have looked confused because Aaron laughed at me. You should see your face. It's hilarious. I stayed professional. I guess I don't entirely understand what you said. What's to understand? Dad looked out for himself and said, fuck the rest of us. He shrugged again, watching me while he took a long slip of his drink. Then he said, no big surprise there. That's the Darabont way. Chapter 14. After Aaron spotted a neighbor and excused himself to go say hello, I wandered toward Mark Clavers in the corner. He wasn't fooled by my attempt to seem casual, so I gave up and walked straight towards him. Who the fuck are you? He growled, clutching his drink even tighter to his chest. Stefan Kopriva. I held out my hand. His dark expression softened slightly. Chesky, huh? I nodded, impressed. Most people had difficulty with my name. Even fewer realized it was Czech. How did you know? My full name is Mariosh. Family name in the old country, Klavershinsky. He shrugged. Some asshole at Paris Island shortened it to Clavers when my grandfather came over from Poland. I see, I said. And you're Mick's business partner? Ha! Mar let out a single barking laugh. Mick didn't have partners. I was his apprentice for a while, then his employee. But you don't know the shoe store now, don't you? It's a leather workshop, he corrected. Then he jerked his thumb toward his chest. And I'm the only reason the doors are still open. If Mick had his way, we never had taken any work outside of shoes. The shop would have failed 20 years ago. I'm the one who diversified. Smart, I said, adapting to the changing world. His eyes narrowed. Are you mocking me? Just exactly who in the fuck are you anyway? I told you, I said. No, you told me your name, he said, aggression in his voice. How do you know Mick? I went with the truth. We played checkers in the park. Mar's mouth fell open. Checkers in the... He shook his head, his jaw snapping shut in anger. All day long, he sits in the sun while I... He cut himself off and glared at me. I saw you come in with the daughter, little Miss Hot Pants. I nodded. I gave her a ride. I'll bet, he said with a snort. Mr. Clavers? Pieprich toyavoi matai, Clavers growled. I barely stood the few Czech phrases that my grandmother spoke often, so his Polish words completely foreign to my ears. But there was no mistaking the nature of what he said. He wanted me to leave. I didn't bother saying goodbye or offering any condolences. Instead, I turned and walked away. Chapter 15. Solve it yet? Lula asked me. We were standing on the back deck of Donald Darabon's home while she smoked. The closed sliding glass door behind us kept everyone else out of immediate earshot. I don't know what kind of magic you expect, I said, but I've barely had a chance to talk to anyone. I expect you to figure out who killed my dad, she said. She took a drink of her vodka and added, Why would they be so... Why? Sorry. She took a drink of her vodka and added, Why they did it would be nice to know too, but I'll settle for who. You're jumping to conclusions, I reminded her. That he was murdered? She shook her head. No, that's the easy part. One of these cowards finally got tired of waiting and stepped up. I took a step closer. You said he slipped in the bathroom. No, that's what the cops said happened. She took a drag of her cigarette and blew out the smoke. That's what they want the truth to be because it makes things easiest for them. Lula, why would someone want to kill Mick? She looked at me like I was dense. You haven't figured that out yet? I shrugged. He was gruff, I get that. I saw it too, but... He was a self-centered, spiteful son of a bitch, Lula said, without any emotion attached to the words. As a boss, he was one step above a slave driver. As a father, if he wasn't in the same boss mode, then he was doing his best to ignore the fact that he had children. Kicked each of us out of the house the day after our 18th birthday. Where was your mother in all of this, I asked. She died giving birth to Aaron, Lula explained. So any buffer between Daddy and us was essentially gone at that point. Still wasn't a motive, I thought. Lots of parents turn their kids loose at 18. No, they don't. Lula blew smoke in my direction. But it was a relief, honestly. Like I said, Daddy either rode us hard or ignored us. There was no in between. I thought about that for a few moments. Then I asked, what about grandkids? I've heard that can have an impact on people. Lula somehow snorted while inhaling, a feat that I had to admit was mildly impressive. Donnie the Wonder Child gave him a couple of grandkids, because of course he did. He was always trying to do something to gain Dad's approval. Did it work? I asked. She laughed derisively. What do you think? I don't know, I said. That's why I'm asking. Lula inhaled deeply and let out a long, smoky billow. The man spent his days sitting in the park playing a stupid kids game with strangers. Does that sound like the Grandpa of the Year material to you? I shrugged. I didn't know how he spent his evening or his days. I hadn't seen him in the park. All right, let's say for a moment that Mick wasn't well liked. But Nixon wasn't well liked, she snapped. Most people hated my dad. I pushed. Because he was gruff? Distant? Lula held her cigarette between her lips and counted off on her fingers. He rode Donnie mercilessly, not that that suck-up didn't deserve it, but when Donnie wanted to open up a store, and of course, of all things, the ass-kisser chose a shoe store, Dad refused to help him. Not only that, he considered it competition and threatened to cut Donnie out of his will. There's a will, I said, confirming new information. I'm getting to that. She flicked up a second finger. Me, he expected to take Mom's place after she died and be responsible for all the wifely chores around the house. Except for one, of course. She blew out a long stream of smoke. At least that's one thing Dad never was, some kind of pervert. But he didn't want me spending time with boys when there was a house to clean, my little brother to mind, and meals to cook, that's for sure. She extended a third finger. Aaron, he completely ignored 90% of the time. On the rare occasion he noticed he had a third kid, it was to tell him all the ways he was a fucked up failure. She shook her head. Did wonders for his psychological development, as you no doubt saw. I didn't spend much time with him, I said. Shouldn't take that much to get a drift. She flipped up her fourth finger. And then there's Mar, the long-running indentured servant, basically. I don't know what kind of deal Dad worked out with him, but it clearly was to his advantage. Mar busts his ass running the leather shop, but he doesn't own it. At least, I don't think he does. Their power dynamic is as lopsided now as it always was. I took it all in. How do you know this? She shrugged, reaching up for a cigarette. Her eyes bored into me. You sure you want to know? If I'm going to help you, I said, I need to know everything. Nobody knows everything, she said. But here's this. I fucked Mar a few times years ago. I thought it might get a rise out of Dad, but either he didn't notice or didn't care. She stubbed out her cigarette on the wood railing. But during those little trysts, he let enough slip to paint the picture I just shared with you. Dad still had his foot on Mar's throat, even though he was supposedly retired. I leaned on the railing and looked out over the Donald DeBon's lush backyard. He either spent some time on the landscaping or had it hired out. All right, your point's made, But being angry at someone doesn't equate to a motive for murder. No, but money does. Lula took out another cigarette and lit it. And there's plenty of motivation around that. Such as, I asked, fishing for something to hook on to. Such as how Donnie's store is bleeding like a stuck pig. I already told you that. She shook her head. Malls are starting to die. If he had any clue, he'd transition to 100% online. My brows knitted. That might work for Amazon, but nothing. Lula waved away my objection. It's 2011, not 1911. He should sell all his shoes on the internet, no problem. But he won't, because Dad wouldn't like it. Even though Dad's gone, he still wants the old man's approval. He took in a deep drag and spoke in croaking tones while holding it in. But that doesn't mean he couldn't use some of that sweet inheritance money to stave off the inevitable. I watched as she exhaled. The blue-tinged smoke rose up in the air and disappeared. I still wasn't convinced that someone had killed Mick, but we were running out the string on the idea, so I went with my most likely suspect. What about Mar? I asked. Lula laughed. Killing Dad? He wins no matter what. Any one of us kids would sell the stake we inherit, probably on the cheap, and there'd be no more oversight, no more of that overlord mentality. Or hell, maybe he wants to sell it outright and move on himself. Dad would never allow that to happen, so getting rid of the old man solves more than a few of his problems. She reached for her vodka and took a slug. Plus, she added, look at the guy. He's more mortician than leather worker. How someone looks doesn't really mean anything, I said. Ha! Lula shook her head, grinning. Shows what you know. How someone looks means everything. Well, I said, their appearance doesn't make them any more likely to be a murderer. She grinned. Agree to disagree on that one. Took a sip of my water, looking at the bright flowers that lined the fence. Who has access to Mick's house? I asked. House? She said. He lives in an apartment. That surprised me, especially if he was as well off as Aaron and Lula both described. Don't get me wrong, Lula said. They're nice apartments. Security's good too, but renting was just one more way Dad hoarded his money. He said buying a house was a false investment. He'd rather pay rent and avoid taxes and repair costs and whatever else. She flicked some ash and then shrugged. I guess what he said must have sunk in because I've always rented too. She waved a hand at the yard and the house. Buying this was about the only thing Donnie ever did that he didn't have Daddy Please Approve written all over it. His wife insisted, I imagine. It is a nice place, I agree, returning to the point I wanted to explore. But who had access to Mick's apartment? She shrugged. Any of us could visit, I suppose. Nobody had a key, I asked. Nope. Lola shook her head while she smoked. He never allowed that. Not a chance. Which left me with a question. Who found him then? Neighbor lady, Sally Grayson, Lula said. She called the cops when she didn't see Dad for a couple of days. I guess she was used to seeing him in the afternoon with his stupid checkerboard in the apartment courtyard. The cops came and they found him. I twisted the cap back on my water bottle. So no one else had access to his apartment. Even if these people with motive, it doesn't sound like opportunity was there. A mischievous smile spread across Lula's face. Oh, come on. You're old enough to know that, with sufficient motive, opportunity is never that difficult to create. I shifted uncomfortably and looked away, thinking. I'd never been a homicide investigator, but that didn't stop me from learning that people usually killed for many of the same reasons. Money ranked high on that list. Turning back to Lula, who was staring at me with an amused expression, I asked, What about the will? What's it say? She arched a brow. What will? She asked. Chapter 16. We left the reception a short time later. I didn't bother to say goodbye to anyone. I'd already offered my condolences, and they'd been mostly unwelcome. Likewise, Lula left without any farewells. As we walked toward my car, her shoulder brushed mine. Thanks for that, she said quietly. For what? I asked. She looked back at her brother's house. For helping me through all of this. I laughed. You don't seem like the kind of person who needs much in the way of help. She was quiet for a few steps. Then she said, those are the kind of people that need the most help. Chapter 17. I took Lula home after the reception. She started by giving me directions, but I stopped her and just asked for the address. Being a cop, even for a short time, I had the effect of imprinting the geography of River City on my brain. My investigative work didn't have as intense need for orientation, but I used it enough to keep the skill from atrophying. Lula rode in silence, staring out the window. I wondered what her thoughts were, but didn't want to ask. Everyone grieves in their own way, in their own time. 10 minutes later, I pulled up to her house in northeast River City. The street contained well-maintained homes with well-kept-up yards. Clearly, a homeowner's block. Of course, that patchwork nature of the city meant that the next block over could easily be littered with rentals or trashed homes. Do you want to come in? Lula asked me. I shook my head. No thanks. You'll enjoy it, she said, and touched my arm lightly. It'd be my way of saying thank you. You already said thank you, Lula. Her mischievous smile returned. I did, didn't I? Well, there goes that excuse. Her fingers traced a slow circle on my bicep. But we don't need an excuse. We're both adults. I'm with someone, I said. She lifted a single shoulder in a bare shrug. She doesn't need to know. Agree to disagree, I thought, and then I said, thought you were married. Her eyebrows flickered upward. Who do you think is waiting inside? Of course, he'll slip into the closet when he hears the front door open. She made a circle with her thumb and forefinger and held it up to her eye. Peer through the crack and watch. Donald's comment about being one of Lula's cuckold toys suddenly made a lot more sense. I shook my head again. Not my scene, I said. She pouted. Won't you console a grieving daughter? Not like that, I said. There's no better way, she cooed. Sorry, I said, not bothering to sound sincere. Her dramatic affectation fell away, though some genuine disappointment remained. Your loss, she said airily. I'm sure, I said, hoping to put this at an end. If you were sure, you wouldn't pass me up. She reached for the door handle, then stopped. You're still working for me, though, right? I hesitated. I never actually said, oh, bullshit. I saw you talking to Donnie and Aaron and even Mar. You're working for me. She popped open the door. Call me tomorrow. We'll meet and you can report in. I sighed. Where? She smirked. Well, clearly not in my boudoir, so pick a coffee shop. She got out of the car and headed up the walk. The swing in her hips was pronounced, but I couldn't decide how much of it was habit and how much was meant for me. All right, Jack, that's where we're going to leave Stuff's investigation for the week.
Frank, please don't make my mom read that again. That is so gross. It's happened before. I think it was Kyra Jacobs wrote some stuff into the end of that one. And I went, oh, I get to hear my mom read that one. That's just a pleasant time for all of us.
Let's talk about murder instead. Okay.
I know what?
What?
Okay, fine. You're right.
So Mick is dead.
Mick is dead.
Apparently, he may have been kind of awesome-ish to Steph, but he was an asshole in real life.
Apparently.
Kind of a philosophical asshole, though.
A philosophical asshole? That's a great brand of asshole. I'm gonna trademark that.
So he's got 3 kids.
Yes.
Donald
Duck.
Lula.
Lola Bunny.
Lola or Lula? I thought it was
Lula, but I was just thinking of Looney Tunes characters.
And then we have Aaron, that is spelled E-R-I-N, even though he is a boy.
All right. Well, it happens.
And then we have Mar Clavers.
Yeah.
I like the name Marouche. Marouche.
I was just thinking of Mar from Home Alone.
He kind of was described looking like Mar from Home Alone.
Yeah.
So when we pick up next week, Steph will be coming back from the funeral and we'll pick up the investigation.
Seems like it. And Mick Jagger will continue to be dead.
I do want to tell you all
Australian Mick Jagger.
Australian. Tell you a little bit about Frank Zafiro. He writes gritty crime fiction from both sides of the badge. During his life, he has been a military intelligence linguist, which, by the way, I have to apologize for the Polish. Frank is a linguist. Tina is not. Frank's also been a police officer. He had a 20-year career, retiring as a captain, and an independent consultant and instructor. He has taught both writing and police-related topics at the collegiate level and professional venues. Through it all, he's been a writer. To date, he has published 48 novels and over 100 short stories and appeared in over 50 anthologies. He lives in Redmond, Oregon with his wife, Christy, who is a teacher. So with that, we're going to wrap it up for this week. Support our show by subscribing, telling a mystery lover about us, and giving a 5-star review. Check out our website, tgwolff.com/podcast, for links to this season's authors. Mysteries to Die For is hosted by TG Wolff and Jack Wolff. A Checkered Past is written by Frank Zafiro. Music and production are by Jack Wolff. Episode art is by TG Wolff. Come back here next week for the conclusion of A Checkered Past by Frank Zafiro. All right, Jack, the floor is yours.